There are places in this world where the earth itself remembers, where the dust holds secrets that should have stayed buried, where the wind carries voices that have no mouths to speak them. Black Canyon, Nevada, is one of those places. In the summer of 1873, a group of men went looking for fortune in those ancient walls. What they found instead was a reckoning older than any nation, older than any flag, older than the very concept of ownership itself. The West was not won. It was taken, and sometimes the land takes back. The story begins not with the arrival of white men, but centuries before, when the Paiute people knew the canyon as a place of power and death. They called it different names in different seasons. In winter, it was the place where shadows sleep. In summer, the canyon of burning bones. But there was another name, one spoken only in whispers around dying fires, a name that meant something close to the mouth that swallows light. The elders forbade their young from entering the deepest parts of the canyon, where the walls narrowed to cracks barely wide enough for a man to pass through, where the sun reached the canyon floor for only minutes each day, where strange marks covered the stone in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. According to the old stories, there had once been a village at the mouth of Black Canyon, a prosperous place where the hunting was good and the water ran clear. But the people grew proud. They grew hungry for more. They began to venture deeper into the canyon, following veins of a yellow metal that caught the light like pieces of captured sun. The metal was beautiful, and it drove them mad with wanting. They dug into the canyon walls with tools of bone and stone, pulling the yellow metal from the earth in quantities that made neighboring tribes jealous and afraid. Then, one autumn, when the leaves turned to copper and blood, the digging went too deep. The miners broke through into a chamber that should not exist, a hollow place in the heart of the stone where something had been sealed away since the world was young. What they found in that darkness, the stories do not say clearly. Some spoke of bones arranged in patterns that formed doorways to nowhere. Others mentioned voices that came from beneath the ground, speaking in languages that predated human speech. All agreed on one thing: the miners did not return as themselves. They came back changed. Their eyes were wrong, reflecting light like animals caught in firelight. They moved with strange, jerking motions as though their bodies had forgotten how to be human. They spoke in unison when they spoke at all, and their words made no sense. Syllables strung together in rhythms that sounded almost like music, almost like screaming. Within a week, every person in the village had either fled or transformed into something wearing human skin like an ill-fitting coat. The Paiute who escaped burned sage for days, performed rituals of cleansing, and declared the canyon closed. For generations, they kept the secret, kept the warning, kept the vigil. But secrets have a way of fading. Warnings become legends. Legends become stories. Stories become nothing but old superstitions told to children who no longer believe. By 1873, most of the Paiute had been pushed away from their ancestral lands. The Nevada Territory was filling with fortune seekers, men who saw only opportunity in every shadow, profit in every stone. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed 4 years earlier, and it had opened the West like a wound, pouring people into spaces that had once been empty, or at least empty of white men. Gold and silver rushes had created and destroyed a dozen towns in as many years. Men arrived with dreams of wealth and left as ghosts, if they left at all. Black Canyon had avoided attention for years simply because it was difficult to reach and had a reputation for bad luck. Prospectors who ventured too close reported feeling watched, feeling cold, even in the burning desert sun, hearing sounds that had no source. Equipment malfunctioned. Animals refused to enter certain areas. The few who tried to establish claims in the canyon proper came back empty-handed and tight-lipped, unwilling to discuss what they had or had not found. After a while, the canyon earned a simple designation on the rough maps that circulated among mining camps, not worth the trouble. Then James Holloway arrived. Holloway was not like the other prospectors. He came from Boston money, educated at Harvard, with a degree in geology and mineralogy that meant nothing out here but that he carried like armor against the raw chaos of the frontier. He had studied maps and mineral surveys with an obsessive attention to detail. He had read every report, every claim, every whisper about Nevada's mineral wealth, and he had become convinced through some combination of science and intuition that Black Canyon was hiding something extraordinary. Holloway had money enough to hire a proper crew. He did not need to rely on drifters and dreamers. He wanted professionals, men who knew mining, who knew geology, who knew how to work hard and follow orders. By June of 1873, he had assembled a group of 12 men, each skilled in some aspect of mining or engineering. There was Thomas Brennan, a mining engineer who had worked in the silver fields of Colorado. There was Samuel Chen, one of the few Chinese workers who had managed to save enough money to work independently after the railroad was completed. There was Miguel Santos from California, an expert in explosives. There were the Dalton brothers, Frank and Henry, who knew metalwork and could repair any tool or equipment. There were others, each bringing some necessary skill, each dreaming of the fortune they would split if Holloway was right about the canyon. They arrived at Black Canyon in late June, when the heat was already brutal and the sun turned the desert into a furnace. The canyon itself cut through the landscape like a wound, a gash of shadow in an ocean of light. From a distance, it looked deceptively shallow, but as they approached, the true depth revealed itself. The walls dropped away into darkness, red and orange stone striped with black mineral deposits that looked like old blood dried in the sun. The air coming out of the canyon was cold, unnaturally so, carrying a smell like wet stone and old copper. Holloway had chosen a spot near the canyon's mouth to establish their base camp. It was a relatively flat area, with access to a thin stream that trickled out of the canyon, water cold and clear, and tasting faintly of minerals. They erected canvas tents, established a cooking area, set up equipment for assaying ore samples. It was professional, organized, efficient. Holloway ran the operation like a military campaign, with schedules and assignments and clear expectations. This was not a desperate scramble for quick wealth. This was methodical exploitation of natural resources. This was progress. The first week was spent surveying. They mapped the canyon in careful detail, using surveying equipment and taking measurements, recording everything in leather-bound notebooks. The canyon was deeper and more complex than initial observations suggested. It branched in unexpected ways, with side passages that twisted back on themselves or terminated in dead ends. The walls bore strange marks that Holloway initially attributed to water erosion, but that seemed, on closer inspection, to form almost deliberate patterns. Brennan, the mining engineer, noted them in his reports, but could offer no explanation for their regularity. They also found signs of previous mining activity, though nothing recent. There were old shafts, crudely dug, reinforced, with nothing but hope and desperation. Most had collapsed. A few remained open, dark mouths leading back into the stone. These old workings showed traces of copper and silver, but nothing substantial. Whatever miners had worked here before had not found enough to make the effort worthwhile. But Holloway was not interested in surface finds. His research suggested that the real wealth lay deeper, in geological formations that required serious excavation to reach. By the second week, they began to dig. Holloway had selected a site about a quarter mile into the canyon where his instruments detected promising mineral signatures. The work was hard and slow. The rock was dense, stubborn, requiring careful use of explosives to break it apart without causing cave-ins. Miguel Santos set the charges with expert precision, calculating angles and depths, using just enough black powder to fracture the stone without shattering it. The explosions echoed in the canyon like thunder or like screaming, depending on who you asked later. As they dug deeper, they began to find things. Small things at first, fragments of pottery that had no business being so far underground, pieces of worked stone, tools, or ornaments, impossible to date but clearly human-made. Bones, animal bones, mostly, but occasionally something that looked unsettlingly human, though Holloway insisted they were probably from deer or mountain goats, the skull fragments just distorted by time and pressure. They found these objects embedded in the stone itself, as though they had been there when the rock was formed, which made no geological sense at all. The men began to feel uneasy. It started as small things, trouble sleeping, dreams that were too vivid, too real, dreams of digging in darkness while something whispered in languages made of clicks and hisses. Equipment that worked fine one day would malfunction the next for no apparent reason. Drills would bend. Picks would break on stone that should have been soft. The stream that supplied their water began to taste strange. Not bad exactly, just wrong, like it was water from somewhere else, from some other kind of earth. Samuel Chen was the first to suggest they might be intruding on something sacred. He had heard stories from Paiute workers on the railroad about places that should not be disturbed, about spirits that lived in stone and shadow. He mentioned this one evening around the campfire, speaking carefully, trying not to sound superstitious. Holloway dismissed it immediately. This was Nevada Territory, not some ancient kingdom ruled by ghosts. They were mining. They were creating wealth. They were bringing civilization to empty places. There was no room for fear of shadows and stories, but the shadows in Black Canyon seemed deeper than they should be. Even at midday, when the sun was directly overhead, there were places where the darkness seemed absolute, seemed to have weight and texture, seemed to move when you were not looking directly at it. The men started to avoid those spots without consciously deciding to, the way animals avoid places where predators hunt. 3 weeks into the operation, they broke through. Miguel had set charges in what Brennan calculated would be the final layer before reaching a significant ore deposit. The explosion was larger than expected, shaking the canyon walls, sending clouds of dust billowing up from the shaft. When the dust settled and they descended with lanterns, they found that they had indeed broken through into something, but it was not a vein of gold or silver. It was a chamber. The chamber was not natural. That was the first thing they understood. Standing at the threshold with lamplight pushing weakly against the darkness, the walls were too smooth, too regular. They bore the marks of tools, but tools Unlike anything used in modern mining, the space was roughly circular, about 30 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a dome shape at the center. The floor was level, covered with a layer of dust so fine it looked like ash, and covering every surface, carved into the stone with painstaking precision, were symbols. The symbols defied easy description. They were not pictures exactly, though some suggested forms that might have been animals or humans or something in between. They were not writing, though they had the structured quality of language. They seemed to shift in the lamplight, to rearrange themselves when viewed from different angles. Looking at them for too long produced a sensation like vertigo, like falling, like standing at the edge of something vast and wrong. In the center of the chamber, the dust had been disturbed. Something had been there, something large enough to leave an impression in the dust, a shape like a body or a bundle. But whatever had created the impression was gone. Around the impression, arranged in a careful circle, were objects. There were more fragments of pottery, these intact enough to show designs of spirals and angular patterns. There were bundles of what might once have been fabric or leather, now rotted to brittle fragments. There were tools made of stone and bone, including some that had no obvious purpose, shapes that hurt to hold, that seemed to twist in the hand like living things. And there were bones. The bones were arranged in patterns that followed no anatomy of any creature they recognized. Ribs formed spirals. Vertebrae were stacked in columns that could not have supported any living spine. Skulls, some human, some animal, some ambiguous, were placed at cardinal points around the circle, facing inward toward the empty space where something had lain. The bones were old beyond easy measure, stained dark by minerals and time. But they were not fossilized. They retained an organic quality, as though they had been waiting rather than dying. Holloway ordered everything documented, measured, cataloged. He was a man of science, and his first instinct was to understand, to classify, to fit this discovery into some framework of knowledge. But even as he took notes and made sketches, even as he maintained his veneer of rational inquiry, something in his eyes had changed. He looked at the chamber the way a starving man looks at food, the way a drowning man looks at air. He had found something, not what he was looking for, but something perhaps more valuable, something unique, something that would make his name. The other men were less enthusiastic. Standing in that chamber felt wrong in ways they could not articulate. The air was cold, far colder than it should be this deep underground in the Nevada desert. The lamplight seemed to fail at the edges of the space, as though the darkness there was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something that consumed it. And there was sound, or almost sound, a vibration at the edge of hearing that felt more like pressure in the skull than actual noise. It was the sound of something waiting. Brennan suggested they seal the chamber and continue looking for mineral deposits elsewhere in the canyon. Whatever this place was, it was not a mine, and disturbing it further seemed unwise. But Holloway would not hear it. He wanted the artifacts removed. He wanted them studied. He wanted the university men back in Boston to see what he had found. This was archaeology, history, knowledge. This was worth more than gold. So they began to remove the objects, carefully at first, with reverence for the unknown. They wrapped the pottery fragments in cloth. They placed the bone tools in wooden boxes packed with straw. They sketched the positions of everything before disturbing it, creating a record of how it had been found. It was professional. It was methodical. It was the worst mistake any of them would ever make. The first skull they moved was human, or had been. It was small, possibly a child, though the proportions were slightly off in ways that suggested either deformity or something else. When Samuel Chen lifted it from its position, the skull was heavier than it should be, as though the bone had absorbed metal from the surrounding stone. The moment it was moved from its place in the circle, the temperature in the chamber dropped, not gradually, but instantly, a plunge that turned breath to fog and raised goosebumps on skin. The lamps flickered, and from somewhere deeper in the canyon, or perhaps from beneath them, or perhaps from nowhere and everywhere at once, there came a sound like grinding stone, like bones breaking, like laughter, without lungs to produce it. The men froze. They looked at each other in the wavering lamplight, seeing their fear reflected in each other's faces. Holloway ordered them to continue. It was just air moving through the canyon, he said. It was temperature differentials creating acoustic phenomena. It was nothing. But his voice shook when he said it, and no one believed him, not even himself. They worked faster after that, no longer careful, no longer reverent. They wanted to finish and get out. They piled artifacts into crates without proper documentation. They grabbed bones without noting their positions. They disturbed the circle, broke the pattern, scattered the dust that had lain undisturbed for unknowable years, and with each object removed, the chamber seemed to become more hostile. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols seemed to writhe, the darkness at the edges pressed closer, and sometimes, in the corners of vision, it seemed to have shapes, suggestions of forms that stood just beyond the reach of light, watching, waiting. By the time they finished loading the last crate onto the cart they had lowered into the shaft, every man was shaking. Not from cold, though it was freezing now in the chamber. Not from exertion, though the work had been hard. From fear, pure animal fear that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the ancient parts of the brain that remembered when humans were prey. They climbed out of the shaft quickly, not speaking, not looking back. Only when they were back at the surface, back in the brutal desert sun that felt like salvation after the cold darkness below, did they begin to breathe normally again. That night, the dreams began, all of them. Every man in the camp experienced the same nightmare with only slight variations. They dreamed they were back in the chamber, but the chamber was no longer empty. The space where the impression had been in the dust was now occupied. Something lay there, something that might have been human once, but had been changed by the earth, by time, by forces that had no names. It was both corpse and not corpse, both solid and vapor, both there and not there. In the dream, they approached it, unable to stop themselves, and it opened eyes that were hollow pits filled with the same darkness that pressed at the edges of the chamber. And it spoke, not with voice, but directly into their minds, words that were not words, but concepts pushed into consciousness like hot iron pressed into flesh. It told them that they had broken something. It told them that seals, once opened, cannot easily be closed. It told them that the dead have their own laws, their own territories, and that the living had just declared war on the dust. It told them other things too, things that did not translate into human thought, mathematics of decay, an architecture of entropy, a grammar of returning to the earth. And then it stood up. The men woke screaming, every one of them. The sound filled the camp, a chorus of terror that sent animals fleeing for miles around. They sat in their tents, shaking, some weeping, some silent, with the kind of shock that comes from looking at something the mind was never meant to process. Holloway tried to restore order, tried to explain it as shared hysteria, as contaminated water, or bad food producing hallucinations. But he had experienced it too, and his explanations sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Miguel Santos announced he was leaving. He would forfeit his pay, forfeit his share of any fines, forfeit everything. He just wanted to be away from this place. 2 others agreed immediately. They began packing their belongings before dawn, working with frantic energy, glancing constantly at the canyon mouth as though expecting something to emerge from it. Holloway tried to stop them, argued that they had a contract, that abandoning the operation now would mean losing everything they had worked for. But he could not meet their eyes when he said it, and they left anyway, taking 3 horses and heading south toward the nearest town, a mining settlement called Harrisville, about 30 miles away. The remaining 9 men tried to continue. They needed to believe this was still salvageable, that the fear was temporary, that daylight and routine would restore normalcy. They went back to work, back to the shaft, back to digging. But the mine had changed. The shaft that had been stable for weeks now groaned and shifted. Support timbers cracked without warning. Tools disappeared, only to be found later in places they could not have been put. The air down in the darkness carried that smell of wet stone and copper, but now there was something else beneath it, something organic and rotten, like meat left in the sun. And there were sounds, constant now, no longer occasional or ambiguous, scratching, dragging, breathing, if something that no longer needed lungs could be said to breathe. The sounds came from side tunnels, from behind them, from ahead, always just out of sight, always just close enough to hear. When they tried to investigate, bringing lanterns and courage, they did not feel. They found nothing, just stone and shadow and the sensation of having just missed something, of arriving a moment too late to see whatever had made the noise. On the 4th day, after opening the chamber, the Dalton brothers were working alone in a side tunnel, reinforcing supports, when they heard Frank call out. Henry went to investigate and found his brother standing motionless, staring at the tunnel wall, his lamp on the ground at his feet. Henry touched his shoulder, asked what was wrong. Frank turned slowly, and his eyes were wrong. Not in any way Henry could articulate, but wrong, like looking at a reflection that did not quite match. Frank smiled, and it was not his smile. He opened his mouth to speak, and what came out was not his voice. It was the sound of the chamber, of stone grinding on stone, of dead things moving through dark places. Henry ran. He ran back through the tunnels, calling for help, his lamp swinging wildly, throwing manic shadows on the walls. By the time the others reached him, he was incoherent, babbling about his brother, about something in the tunnel, about eyes that reflected no light. They went back together, armed with picks and shovels, telling themselves they would find Frank confused or injured, something explainable, something fixable. They found Frank hanging from the support beams, not hanged, not with rope, but somehow pressed into the wood itself, his body bent at angles that should have broken bones, his face turned toward them with that same wrong smile, his eyes now completely black, like holes punched through reality into somewhere else. He was moving, or something was moving inside him, motion beneath the skin, like things crawling, like the earth reclaiming what was hers. And he spoke again, in that voice of grinding stone. And this time they understood fragments of what he said. He said the seal was broken. He said the gold they found was bait, had always been bait, had been placed there centuries ago by people who understood what lived in the deep places and knew the only way to keep it sealed was to make the seal invisible, to hide it behind curses and warnings that would fade with time. He said the dead have waited so long. He said hunger does not fade with centuries. It only deepens, crystallizes, becomes something purer and more terrible. He said they would all return to the earth one way or another. It was only a question of whether they returned as corpses or as doorways. Then Frank lunged at them, moving with speed impossible for a human body contorted as his was, and they ran. They ran back through the tunnels, through the shaft, back to the surface, where the sun was setting and long shadows were claiming the canyon. They emerged into the red light of dusk and kept running back to camp, where they grabbed what weapons they had, mostly tools, and a few rifles kept for hunting. Holloway tried to organize a response, tried to impose order on chaos, but the fear had gone beyond his ability to manage. They spent that night in the camp, taking turns on watch, jumping at every sound. The canyon seemed alive with movement now, with shapes that flickered at the edge of firelight, with sounds that might have been wind, or might have been voices, or might have been the earth itself shifting and groaning. Twice during the night, they heard Frank's voice calling to them from the darkness, pleading for help, saying it was all a misunderstanding, saying he was himself again and hurt and needed them. But the voice was wrong. The words were right, but the tone was off, like someone reading a script without understanding the meaning. They did not respond. They did not go to help. They sat in a firelight and prayed to whatever God they individually believed in and waited for dawn. Dawn came, but it brought no relief. The sun rose over the canyon rim, but it seemed to struggle to reach the valley floor, as though the darkness there resisted its usual retreat. The light that did reach them was thin, watery, insufficient, and in that weak morning light they saw what had happened during the night. The artifacts they had removed from the chamber, the crates they had carefully packed and stored at the edge of camp, were gone, not stolen, not in any conventional sense. The crates were still there, but they were empty, broken from the inside, with the lids forced off from within, and leading away from the crates into the canyon were tracks in the dust. Not footprints exactly, but trails, drag marks, as though something had crawled out of the boxes and made its way back into the earth. Holloway made the decision. They were leaving. Today, now, they would take what they could carry, abandon the equipment, abandon the mine, abandon everything. Survival was the only priority. They packed quickly, their movements jerky with adrenaline and fear. The horses were nervous, skittish, rolling their eyes and pulling at their tethers. It took precious time to calm them enough to saddle and load. All the while, they felt watched. The sensation was overwhelming, undeniable. Something was observing them from the canyon walls, from the mine entrance, from the shadows that seemed too dark and too deliberately placed. They were almost ready to leave when Samuel Chen pointed at the canyon rim. There were figures standing there, silhouettes against the morning sky. At first, they hoped it was the three men who had left days earlier, returning for some reason. But the figures were wrong. They stood too still. They were shaped wrong, proportions off, like humans remembered by something that had never been human. And there were too many of them. Not 3, not 12, dozens, hundreds perhaps, lining the canyon rim, standing motionless, watching. Then the figures began to descend, not climbing, not picking their way down the rocky slopes, but moving in that strange jerking motion, like insects, like corpses, animated by something that did not understand how bodies worked. They moved fast, faster than any human should be able to move on that terrain. And as they descended, the men in the camp saw them more clearly, saw that they were indeed bodies, or had been, things that had lain in the earth so long that they were more mineral than flesh, bones held together by dried sinew and fungus, and things that grew in darkness, clothed in rags of whatever they had been buried in, decorated with the jewelry and ornaments of a dozen different cultures, a dozen different eras. Some were recent enough to still have faces. Others were little more than skeletons wrapped in skin like paper. All of them moved with that same terrible purpose, that same hunger that had been waiting in the deep places since before the first white man set foot in Nevada. The miners broke. There was no shame in it, no dishonor. They ran for their lives because that was all that was left to them. They grabbed horses and rode hard toward the south, toward Harrisville, toward civilization and safety and places where the earth stayed where it belonged. Behind them, the dead poured into the canyon like water, like a flood, like the unstoppable force of decay itself. And somewhere in that tide of corpses, Frank Dalton moved among them, no longer human, no longer anything but a warning that would never be heard. They rode through the day, pushing the horses beyond safe limits, stopping only when the animals could no longer continue. They rode through the night, navigating by starlight and memory, starting at every sound. By the time they reached Harrisville the following afternoon, there were only 6 of them. 3 horses had collapsed, forcing those men to ride double, and in the chaos of remounting, something had taken Henry Dalton. One moment he was there, falling behind the group in the darkness. The next moment he was screaming, a sound that cut off abruptly, replaced by silence and the sound of something feeding. Harrisville was a rough mining town, barely more than a collection of tents and crude wooden buildings, but to the survivors it looked like paradise. They rode in screaming, incoherent, and it took hours before anyone could piece together their story. When they finally managed to explain, when they described what they had found and what had found them, they were met with skepticism and contempt. This was the frontier. Men went mad out in the desert. They saw things in the heat. They concocted stories to cover their own failures. Holloway, normally so controlled, so rational, broke down completely, weeping and raving about seals and chambers and the dead walking under the stars. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Cooper, listened politely and then suggested the survivors get drunk, get laid, and get over whatever had happened out in the desert. But 2 things prevented the story from being dismissed entirely. First, the survivors were consistent. 6 men, all telling the same impossible story, all exhibiting the same symptoms of profound psychological trauma. Second, the 3 men who had left early, who had ridden for Harrisville days before, had never arrived. Their route should have brought them straight to town. The desert between Black Canyon and Harrisville was dangerous, but not impossible. Men occasionally got lost or had accidents, but 3 men, all experienced frontiersmen, all vanishing without trace, that was unusual enough to warrant attention. Sheriff Cooper organized a search party. 20 men, well armed, prepared to spend several days scouring the route between Harrisville and Black Canyon. They left at dawn the next day, following the most direct path the 3 missing men would have taken. The survivors begged them not to go, begged them to stay away from the canyon, to let the dead keep what they had claimed. But Cooper was not a man who believed in ghosts or curses. He believed in evidence and bodies and explanations that made sense. He would find the missing men, determine what had happened to the survivors to make them so afraid, and restore order to a situation that was already causing panic in a town that could not afford panic. They found the first body 3 hours out of Harrisville, or rather, they found most of it. The body had been torn apart with savage efficiency, scattered across a wide area, half buried in sand and stone. Scavengers had been at it, but the tearing was wrong, too deliberate, too precise. This was not the work of animals. The body was identified by clothing and personal effects as one of the 3 men who had fled the mine early. His face was intact enough to show an expression of absolute terror, frozen in the moment of death. They found the second body at midday, hanging from a rock formation in a way that suggested it had been placed there intentionally, arranged as a warning or a marker. The body was in worse condition, but again, identifiable. The search party's mood shifted. This was no longer about finding lost miners. This was about something else, something that set off instincts refined over thousands of years of human evolution, instincts that screamed, "Run!" They did not find the third body until they were within sight of Black Canyon. The canyon rose in the distance, a gash of shadow against the bright desert. And there, directly in their path, the third man had been staked to the ground with sharpened pieces of what might have been rib bones. He had been left in the sun long enough that the birds and insects had reduced him to something barely recognizable as human. But worse than the condition of the body was the way it had been positioned. The corpse pointed toward Black Canyon, arm extended, finger bones arranged to indicate direction, as though saying, "This is where you'll end up if you continue." Sheriff Cooper, to his credit, did not order an immediate retreat. He was a lawman, and lawmen investigated crimes, no matter how disturbing. But he did split the group. 10 men would camp here, within sight of the canyon, but not close enough to be in immediate danger. The other 10, including Cooper himself, would proceed to the mining camp to gather evidence and determine exactly what had occurred. It was a compromise between duty and survival instinct, and it satisfied no one, but it was better than turning back with the mystery unsolved. They reached the mining camp in late afternoon. The camp was deserted, but it had not been abandoned in any normal sense. The tents still stood. Equipment lay scattered, but not packed. Supplies remained in boxes. It looked as though the inhabitants had simply vanished mid-task, as though they had been erased from the world between one heartbeat and the next. But there were signs of violence, of struggle, bloodstains on the canvas, tools bent and broken, and everywhere that smell of wet stone and copper in decay. The entrance to the mine shaft loomed at the edge of camp, a square of darkness that seemed to pull at the eye, that seemed to generate its own gravity. Cooper and his men approached it with rifles raised and lamps lit, though the sun was still above the horizon. They called down into the darkness. Their voices echoed back, strange and distorted, and beneath the echo was that sound, that grinding stone, that suggestion of movement in places where nothing should move. 3 men descended into the shaft. Cooper waited at the surface with the others, watching the rope that held the lamps and the men below, watching it sway and twist. From below came the sounds of exploration, boots on stone, voices calling back and forth, the scrape of metal on rock, then silence, a silence so complete it had weight, had texture, had presence. Cooper called down. No response. He called again, louder, his voice taking on an edge of alarm. Nothing. The rope hung motionless. He ordered 2 more men down. They descended slowly, their lamps disappearing into the darkness like stars falling into a void. For several minutes there was no sound at all. Then one of the men reappeared, climbing the rope with frantic speed, his face white, his eyes wide and empty. He reached the surface and collapsed, gasping, unable to speak. When he finally found his voice, all he could say was, "They're down there. All of them. They're all down there, and they're awake." Cooper made the decision that saved the lives of everyone who reached the surface. He ordered the mine sealed. They worked through the night, using the explosives that Holloway's crew had left behind, bringing down the canyon walls, filling the shaft with tons of rock and earth. They worked without stopping, without resting, driven by a fear that was beyond rational thought. They worked while sounds came from beneath their feet, sounds of scratching and digging and something that might have been laughter. They worked while shapes moved in the canyon shadows, while dust storms rose and fell without wind to drive them, while the stars seemed to dim and the moon turned the color of old bone. By dawn, the shaft was buried. They had collapsed half the canyon wall. Doing it created a barricade of stone that would take months to clear even with modern equipment. It would not hold forever. Nothing could hold forever against what waited below, but it might hold long enough for them to get away, to get back to Harrisville, to warn people that Black Canyon was finished, was done, was a place to avoid forever. They rode back hard, not stopping, not looking behind them. Of the 10 men who had entered the camp, 8 made it back to Harrisville. The other 2 simply disappeared during the night, there one moment, gone the next, taken by something that moved too fast to see and left nothing but bloodstains on their saddles. Sheriff Cooper reported the mine as condemned, the site as hazardous, the canyon as unstable and dangerous. He filed official papers declaring Black Canyon off-limits for mining, exploration, or settlement. He made sure the warning went to every territorial office, every land registry, every map maker and surveyor, and he tried very hard not to think about what he had seen in the brief moment before they sealed the shaft. He tried not to remember the lamplight catching on something below, something moving in the collapsed chamber where Holloway had broken through into the old seal. He tried not to remember the faces he had seen, dozens of them, hundreds, all wrong, all watching with eyes that were both dead and aware. He tried not to remember Frank Dalton standing among them, still wearing that wrong smile, waving at Cooper with fingers that were too long, too jointed, too eager. He tried not to remember the words Frank had called up to him, words in that stone-grinding voice. Tell them we're coming. Tell them the earth is hungry. Tell them the dead are patient and payment is due. The survivors scattered. Some went back east, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Nevada. Some lost themselves in other mining towns, drinking away memories that would not fade. Some found religion, spending their remaining years in churches and missions, praying for forgiveness for sins they could not name. Holloway disappeared entirely. There were rumors he was seen in San Francisco, in Denver, in places where maps were made and geological surveys were planned, trying to warn people about places in the earth that should not be disturbed. But no one took him seriously. By then, he was just another broken prospector, another casualty of the frontier's harsh mathematics. Black Canyon was officially avoided. Maps marked it as unstable. Survey reports listed it as geologically unsound. The few people who tried to enter it over the following months reported strange phenomena: compasses spinning wildly, animals refusing to proceed, overwhelming feelings of dread and wrongness. Most turned back. Those who did not were found later, if they were found at all, in states that defied medical explanation. The Paiute, the few who remained in the area, watched and remembered. They knew what had happened, recognized it from their oldest stories. The seal had been broken. The dead had been disturbed. The hunger had been awakened. They performed rituals of containment, built cairns of stone at the canyon approaches, left offerings of sage and tobacco, sang songs that were older than memory in the hope that they might reinforce what had been weakened. They taught their children, again, that some places are sacred, not because they are holy, but because they are prison cells, and the locks must never be tested. Years passed. Black Canyon became a footnote in mining history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of desert prospecting, about the mental strain of isolation and heat. The story of what really happened there faded into rumor, into legend, into the kind of ghost story men told around campfires to scare each other. The dead, after all, stay dead. Everyone knows that. What happened to Holloway's expedition must have been madness, contaminated water, collective hysteria. There had to be a rational explanation. But even now, more than a century and a half later, Black Canyon remains empty. No development has ever succeeded there. Building projects fail, equipment malfunctions, workers report feeling watched, feeling cold, hearing sounds that come from nowhere. The land itself seems hostile, seems to reject human presence. And on certain nights, when the moon is right and the wind comes from the canyon mouth, people swear they can hear sounds from deep below the earth, sounds of movement and hunger and patient, endless waiting. The Paiute elders still tell the story, though fewer young people listen with each generation. They tell of the miners who broke the seal, who woke but should have slept forever. They tell of the price paid and the price still owed. They tell of the dead who walk beneath the earth, growing stronger with each passing year, waiting for the moment when the barriers fail completely, when the seals crumble to dust, when the hunger can finally be satisfied. They tell of the gold that woke the dead, and they warn that some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. In the archives of the Nevada Historical Society, there exists a leather-bound journal, catalogued but rarely examined. It is written in several different hands, as though multiple people contributed to it over a short period of time. Most of the entries are mundane records of mining operations, daily progress reports, geological observations, inventory lists. But the final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, tell a different story. They describe dreams and discoveries, fears and warnings. The last entry is dated July 15th, 1873, 2 days before the mine was sealed. It consists of only one sentence, written in letters so large they fill an entire page. If you are reading this, stay away from Black Canyon. The dead are awake, and they are hungry. Beneath that, in smaller letters, almost an afterthought, a final addendum. We thought we were digging for gold. We were wrong. The gold was digging for us. The journal is kept in a climate-controlled room, handled with gloves, preserved as a historical curiosity. The staff, who occasionally reference it, note that the leather binding is strangely cold to the touch, regardless of room temperature. They note that the pages sometimes seem to have more text than they remember, as though the writing is adding itself over time. They note that working with the journal too long produces headaches and vivid dreams. Most interesting, They note that the journal was not among the original donations to the Historical Society. It simply appeared one day on a shelf where it had not been before, cataloged in a system that keeps meticulous records but has no record of its acquisition. No one questions this too closely. Nevada is full of mysteries after all, full of places where the official history and the real history diverge. It is easier to file the journal, to note its oddities in the catalog, and to focus on more conventional historical materials. It is easier not to ask where it came from, or who keeps updating it, or why it seems to grow heavier each year, as though the pages are slowly transforming into something denser than paper, something more like stone, something patient and waiting and aware. Sometimes late at night, when the Historical Society building is empty and locked, security guards report hearing sounds from the archive room. Not footsteps exactly, more like scratching, like something trying to write, trying to communicate, trying to add one more entry to a journal that should not be able to grow. They investigate, of course. That is their job. And they find nothing, just the journal, sitting exactly where it should be, looking exactly as it always does. But they cannot shake the feeling that it has just been moved, just been closed, that they arrived a moment too late to catch something in the act of reading itself, of remembering itself, of refusing to let its story end. The last guard who examined the journal closely quit 2 weeks later. He would not explain why, would not detail what had disturbed him so profoundly. He simply turned in his uniform and keys and walked away from a job he had held for 15 years. The new guards are warned not to spend too much time in the archives. The official reason is air quality concerns, the possibility of mold or dust accumulation. The unofficial reason is never spoken aloud, but understood by anyone who works night shifts in buildings full of old things and old stories. Some histories do not want to stay in the past. Black Canyon is still there. The barriers erected in 1873 have held mostly, though they have required reinforcement over the years. Landslides, earthquakes, erosion, all carefully documented as natural phenomena, all carefully repaired by crews who never stay longer than necessary, who never ask questions about the cold spots or the sounds or the equipment that fails without explanation. The land around the canyon is owned by the federal government now, managed by the Bureau of Land Management, closed to the public for reasons listed as environmental protection, geological instability, habitat preservation. The truth, kept in files that most BLM employees will never see, is simpler. Some places are better left alone. Some doors, once opened, cannot be fully closed. Some hungers, once awakened, never sleep again. The best that can be done is containment, vigilance, and hope that the barriers hold a little longer, another year, another decade, another century. Hope that whatever waits in the deep places beneath Black Canyon remains sealed, remains patient, remains just barely controlled. But hope is not certainty, and certainty in the end belongs only to the earth. The earth is patient, the earth remembers, and the earth, as the Paiute have always known, always collects its debts. In the modern world, with its satellites and sensors and scientific instruments, Black Canyon registers as an anomaly. The geological surveys show structures that should not exist at the depths they are recorded. The seismic activity does not match any known pattern of tectonic movement. The magnetic fields fluctuate in ways that contradict established physics. These anomalies are noted, filed, and then quietly buried in bureaucratic processes designed to prevent public alarm. The scientists who study these readings sometimes joke about finding evidence of lost civilizations or alien artifacts. They laugh about it. It is easier to laugh than to consider the alternative, to consider that they might be measuring something that is neither lost civilization nor alien, but something else entirely, something that predates civilization, something that waits in the stone and dreams of return. Every few years, someone tries to organize an expedition to Black Canyon. Researchers, filmmakers, thrill seekers, people who hear fragments of the story and want to verify it, to document it, to prove it false or demonstrate it true. These expeditions are denied permits through various official channels. Sometimes the denials are on environmental grounds. Sometimes they cite safety concerns. Sometimes they offer no explanation at all, just a flat refusal and a suggestion to try somewhere else, anywhere else. The people who make these decisions often cannot articulate why they are so insistent on keeping Black Canyon closed. They just know in some part of themselves that has nothing to do with reason that letting people into that canyon would be a mistake that could not be undone. Occasionally, people go anyway, ignoring the warnings and the fences and the signs. They hike in with cameras and equipment, determined to uncover the truth. Most turn back within a few hours, citing bad weather or equipment failure or simply a change of plans. Their footage, when examined later, shows nothing unusual, just desert, just canyon walls, just empty space. But it shows too much of this, frame after frame of empty space, as though the cameras are trying to record something that cannot be photographed, as though they are capturing the edges of something too large or too wrong to fit within the boundaries of light and lens. A few of these trespassers do not return. Search and rescue teams find them eventually, or find what is left of them. The official reports cite exposure, dehydration, falls, animal attacks, all the usual dangers of desert exploration. The unofficial observations, shared quietly among the search teams, note other details. The bodies are always found near the old mine site, always positioned in ways that suggest they were placed rather than fallen, always with expressions that suggest they saw something in their final moments that broke whatever it is in the human mind that maintains sanity. There is a saying among the longtime BLM employees who manage the land around Black Canyon, a saying that is never written down but passed along in quiet conversations. The canyon keeps what the canyon takes. It is a way of saying that some losses cannot be recovered, some mistakes cannot be fixed, some debts can only be paid in full. It is a way of acknowledging that Black Canyon is not really closed for environmental reasons or safety concerns. It is closed because something down there is still hungry, still waiting, still patient, in the way that only the earth can be patient, and letting people near it would be feeding a hunger that has already been fed too well. The story of James Holloway and his mining expedition is mostly forgotten now, a footnote in a larger narrative of Western expansion and failure. The few historians who study Nevada mining history mention it briefly, note the unusual circumstances of the mine's closure, reference the official reports that cite geological instability. They do not mention the survivors' testimonies, which are buried too deep in archival records to be easily found. They do not mention the journal that keeps appearing and disappearing from the Historical Society's collections. They do not mention the rumors that persist among the remaining Paiute communities, rumors of sounds in the night and shapes in the canyon, and warnings that should be heeded but never are. History, after all, is about what can be proven, what can be documented, what can be fit into narratives that make sense within the frameworks we use to understand the world. History is not about what lies beneath those narratives, what scratches at the underside of official records, what waits in the spaces between verified facts. History is not about the dead who refuse to stay dead, or the hunger that transcends time, or the places where the earth remembers things that humanity has chosen to forget. But the absence of official history does not equal the absence of truth. The truth is there, in Black Canyon, in the sealed mine shaft, in the chamber beneath, where symbols still writhe in darkness and bones still remember the patterns they were meant to hold. The truth is patient. The truth is hungry. The truth is waiting for someone else to come looking for gold, for fortune, for fame, or whatever it is that drives humans to dig into places they should leave alone. And eventually, someone will. They always do. That is the nature of humanity, to push boundaries, to test limits, to cross frontiers regardless of the cost. That is why warnings fade and seals weaken and stories become legends, become nothing but foolish superstitions. That is why Black Canyon waits, why the dead beneath the stone remain patient, why the hunger grows with each passing year. Because eventually, inevitably, someone will break through the barriers, will disturb the seal, will release what has been contained. And when that happens, when the dead finally wake fully, when the hunger is finally fed, when the earth finally claims what it has been owed for so long, the world will learn what the Paiute have always known, what Holloway learned too late, what is written in journals that should not exist and recorded in files that will never be released. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, and crossing them changes more than just the land. It changes what is possible, what is real, what lies between life and death, and the places where those boundaries blur. The gold that woke the dead is still there, buried beneath tons of rock and centuries of warning. It gleams in the darkness, patient and bright, waiting to catch the eye of someone new, someone who does not believe the stories, someone who thinks they know better. It is bait, and it always has been. Not gold at all, really, but something that knows how to look like gold, how to call to the part of human nature that wants, that needs, that cannot resist the promise of fortune. And beneath the gold, beneath the stone, beneath the seal that is weakening year by year, the dead are waiting. They have been waiting so long that waiting has become their nature, their purpose, their existence. They dream of the surface, of the sun, of the living world they were torn from centuries ago. They dream of return. They dream of hunger satisfied. They dream of the moment when the barriers finally fail and they can rise again, can walk again, can claim what was taken from them and take everything else besides. That moment is coming. The barriers hold, but they do not heal. The seal weakens, but is not reinforced. The warnings fade, but are not renewed. Time is on the side of the dead, and the dead have nothing but time. So they wait, beneath Black Canyon, beneath the stone, beneath the gold that is not gold, but trap, but lure, but promise. They wait, and they are patient, and they know that eventually, inevitably, someone will come, someone will dig, someone will break the seal, someone will wake the dead. And when that happens, the frontier that was never meant to be crossed will finally be breached, and the world will discover that some hungers are not metaphorical, that some dead things are not symbols, that some warnings are given for reasons that transcend superstition or fear. The world will discover that the earth keeps accounts, and payment is always due, and the currency is always the same. Life for death, flesh for stone, the living for the hunger of the dead. Until then, Black Canyon sits in the Nevada desert, empty and avoided, marked on maps as dangerous, filed in reports as unstable, remembered by fewer people each year. The sun rises and sets over its rim, the wind blows through its depths, the shadows move in patterns that have nothing to do with light, and beneath it all, beneath the stone and sand and silence, something waits, something patient, something hungry, something that was sealed away for good reason and will not stay sealed forever. The gold that woke the dead is still there, still gleaming, still calling, and sooner or later someone will answer.